When the HOA president tried to evict him, she had no idea she was walking into her own nightmare. Darius stepped down from the moving truck, the morning sun filtering through the tall trees, casting warm rays on the front of his new house. It was a beautiful two-story home with modern architecture, large windows overlooking a lush garden, and a stone path leading to the front door, where the HOA flag still fluttered in the breeze. He stood still for a moment, taking in the gentle breeze that carried the fresh scent of newly cut grass. A smile crept onto his face. Years of hard work, countless late nights spent on projects, and now his dream of owning a house in the prestigious Maplewood Hills community had finally come true. A peaceful life where he could sit on the porch, savor a cup of coffee, and enjoy the freedom that was rightfully his. A soft thud behind him broke his thoughts. The movers were unloading boxes from the truck, their lively chatter blending with the scraping of wheels on concrete. Darius walked over to help, giving a hand with the heavier boxes and organizing them on the porch. Suddenly, he felt a pair of eyes on him. Glancing across the street, he noticed a woman standing by her window, staring intently at him. The white curtain quickly fell back into place as their eyes met. A hint of unease pricked at his mind, but Darius shook it off. Maybe it was just curiosity about the new neighbor. People in high-end neighborhoods were often reserved, cautious about new faces. He chose to brush it off, telling himself it would take time for them to warm up to him. As the afternoon stretched on and the last of the boxes were unloaded, Darius sat on the porch steps, wiping the sweat from his forehead and sipping from a cold water bottle. He watched as a few neighbors passed by on their evening walks, but instead of welcoming smiles, they gave him quick, almost fearful glances, hurrying past without a word. His chest tightened slightly. This wasn't what he had imagined when moving into Maplewood Hills, an upscale community where he thought peace and friendliness would prevail. Standing up, Darius forced himself to ignore the uncomfortable feeling gnawing at him, convincing himself that maybe people just needed some time to adjust. A loud car horn broke the silence. An SUV rolled by. Its driver, a middle-aged man, cast a cold, assessing glance at Darius before speeding down the street. Letting out a deep sigh, Darius tried not to let the tension sink into his bones. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, looking around his new space. Despite the judgmental glances and uncomfortable silence from his neighbors, Darius reminded himself that he had worked tirelessly for this dream. This was his house. No one had the right to make him feel unwelcome. Before heading to bed, he stood by the living room window, gazing out at the dimly lit street. A few porch lights flickered from nearby houses, like watchful eyes monitoring his every move. Taking a deep breath, he reassured himself that changes often took time, and he wasn't going to let anyone rob him of his well-deserved happiness. The first day at Maplewood Hills ended with a mix of excitement and subtle anxiety. Yet Darius knew deep down that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he would protect his freedom and his right to belong. The next morning, just as Darius was finishing his first cup of coffee, a loud and forceful knock echoed through the house. He set his mug down and walked to the door, surprised to see an older woman standing on his porch. She looked to be in her mid-60s, with neatly styled gray hair and a crisp beige blouse tucked into tailored slacks. A small pin with the HOA emblem was clipped to her cardigan. Her posture was rigid, eyes sharp and scrutinizing, like a hawk sizing up its prey. Darius offered a polite smile and extended his hand. "Good morning," he greeted. "Can I help you?" The woman didn't take his hand. Instead, she folded her arms tightly across her chest. "I'm Evelyn Monroe," she announced, her voice clipped and authoritative, "president of the Maplewood Hills Homeowners Association." Darius kept his smile steady, despite feeling the tension radiating from her. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Monroe," he replied. Evelyn didn't bother acknowledging his greeting. Instead, she glanced past him into the house, her gaze assessing every detail. "I just wanted to go over a few things," she said, pulling a thick stack of papers from her leather folder. "These are the HOA guidelines. We maintain a high standard here, and I expect every resident to comply." Darius accepted the stack, flipping through it briefly. Rules about lawn maintenance, approved exterior colors, mailbox designs, standard stuff. But Evelyn cleared her throat pointedly. "Your moving truck," she continued, her tone almost accusing. "It's been parked in the driveway since yesterday. That's against community policy. We expect it to be moved immediately." Darius raised an eyebrow, fighting back the urge to laugh at the absurdity. "I'm still unpacking," he explained calmly. "Once I'm done, it'll be gone." Evelyn gave a tight, disapproving nod, as if mentally noting his response. "Good," she said tersely. "Also, trash bins must not be placed at the curb before 6 a.m. on collection day. I noticed yours were out last night." Darius felt his patience thinning. "I didn't put them out," he replied, maintaining his composure. "They were probably left there by the previous owners." Evelyn pursed her lips, clearly unimpressed by his explanation. "Regardless, you need to ensure it doesn't happen again," she snapped. "We have rules for a reason." With that, she spun on her heel and marched off without another word, leaving Darius standing in the doorway, still holding the stack of guidelines. He closed the door slowly, exhaling a long, steady breath. The encounter left a bitter taste, but he tried to brush it off. "Just a bit uptight," he muttered to himself. "Probably the way all HOA presidents are." But as the days went by, it became increasingly clear that Evelyn wasn't just uptight, she was obsessive. Letters and warnings from the HOA started piling up, each one signed by her, criticizing every minor detail about his property: grass length, porch light brightness, driveway cleanliness. It felt like Evelyn was waging a one-woman war against him, determined to make him feel like he didn't belong. Darius knew he needed to tread carefully. He wasn't about to let one narrow-minded neighbor destroy the peace he had worked so hard to achieve. But as more letters arrived and the tension in the neighborhood grew thicker, he couldn't help but wonder just how far Evelyn would go to push him out. Darius stood silently at his mailbox, holding a thick stack of violation notices from the Homeowners Association, HOA. His eyes skimmed over the lines, his jaw tightening with each word. It was the third time that week he had received a notice, and this time it was about his lawn being too high and not conforming to community standards. He glanced out at his front yard. The grass was neatly trimmed, evenly cut, and looked far better than many of the other houses on the street. Some of his neighbors' lawns were overgrown and wild, but none of them seemed to have been targeted. A spark of irritation flickered through him. It didn't make sense. Why was he the only one being singled out? Just as he placed the stack on the kitchen counter, a sharp knock echoed from the door. Darius opened it to find Evelyn standing there once again, clutching yet another set of documents. Her posture was even stiffer than usual, her expression severe. Without waiting for him to greet her, Evelyn pushed the papers into his hands. "This is another formal notice," she declared, her tone brisk and unsympathetic. "Your porch light is too bright and does not meet aesthetic standards." Darius took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "That light fixture was already here when I bought the house," he explained evenly. "The previous owner used it without any issue." Evelyn didn't even blink. "That's irrelevant," she shot back. "We have standards, and your light is not compliant." He watched her leave, her heels clicking harshly on the pavement. As he closed the door, Darius couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration boiling up inside him. It was clear now that Evelyn wasn't merely enforcing the rules. She was actively looking for any excuse to harass him. The next few days only proved his suspicions. One morning he found a violation notice for his car being parked too long in the driveway. Another day, it was about improper placement of trash bins. Then a letter arrived citing inappropriate porch furniture, claiming it didn't fit the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. The unfairness was becoming unbearable. Darius knew it wasn't about the rules. It was about Evelyn wanting to make him feel unwelcome. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear that she was determined to drive him out. Deciding it was time to take action, Darius began observing his neighborhood more carefully. He spent an entire Saturday morning walking around, noting every single violation he could find. Overgrown lawns, broken shutters, faded house numbers, trash bins left out long past collection time. He snapped time-stamped photos of each infraction, documenting them meticulously. That evening, he compiled all the evidence into an organized file and drafted an email to the HOA board. He attached every photo along with a polite but firm message questioning why his property was being scrutinized while identical violations from other residents went ignored. He hit send and leaned back, trying to shake off the tension building up inside him. Darius knew it wasn't going to be that simple. Evelyn wouldn't back down easily, but he wasn't going to just sit back and let her bully him into leaving. A few days later, Darius got a response, not from Evelyn, but from the HOA vice president, Stephen. The email was cautious, thanking him for his concerns and promising to look into the matter. Darius knew that was just a way to buy time, but at least it was a start. That evening, as he sat on his porch, Darius noticed Evelyn standing at the end of his driveway, talking to another man in a polo shirt who was scribbling something on a clipboard. She gestured toward his house, clearly discussing him, and Darius couldn't help but feel his patience stretch thin. He knew Evelyn wasn't going to stop, but now Darius was prepared. If she wanted a fight, he was more than ready to give her one. Calmly, intelligently, and without lowering himself to her petty level. He wasn't just defending his home, he was standing up against the blatant injustice that was eating away at the peace he had worked so hard to achieve. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when Darius took his first sip of coffee, trying to shake off the fatigue from yet another restless night. Just as he set his cup down, a loud, insistent knock sounded from the front door. He sighed, already knowing who it was. Sure enough, when he opened the door, Evelyn stood there, rigid as ever, alongside a tall, stern-looking man dressed in a sharp suit. The man stepped forward, extending a hand. Stephen Reynolds, he introduced himself, voice steady, vice president of the Homeowners Association. Darius nodded, shaking his hand briefly. Evelyn, however, wasted no time. "This is a formal demand for proof of ownership," she stated, holding out a thick folder. "We've received multiple complaints about unauthorized residency and suspicious activity at this property." Darius arched an eyebrow. "Suspicious activity," he repeated calmly. "Care to explain?" Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. "Frequent vehicle changes, odd hours of movement, and deliveries at unconventional times," she listed off, tone as cold as ever. "We need you to prove that you legally own this house." Darius couldn't help but let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "You must be kidding," he said, keeping his composure. "I've lived here less than a month. Of course, there's been activity. I'm moving in." Stephen cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "We're just following protocol," he said cautiously. Darius eyed them both, feeling his patience thin to a dangerous thread. He knew exactly what this was. Evelyn wasn't just enforcing rules. She was targeting him. But instead of lashing out, he maintained his calm. You can access property records yourself, Darius pointed out. It's public information. Evelyn's jaw clenched, clearly not expecting him to stand his ground so firmly. We'd prefer that you submit it directly, she replied, clearly trying to sound authoritative. And if I don't? Darius challenged, his voice level and unwavering. Evelyn's mouth tightened into a forced smile. Then we will escalate the matter to the HOA board, she warned. Darius simply shrugged. Do what you have to do, he said calmly, before stepping back and closing the door in their faces. Inside, Darius leaned against the door, letting out a long breath. He knew that Evelyn wouldn't stop at just complaints and intimidation. She wanted him out, and she was willing to use every bit of influence she had to make that happen. That night, as he sat at his desk, Darius decided it was time to fight back. He made a call to Joe, his real estate attorney, explaining the situation. Joe listened carefully before letting out a chuckle. She really doesn't know who she's messing with, does she? Joe mused. I'll draft a cease and desist letter and file a formal complaint for harassment. Let her deal with that. 3 days later, the HOA emergency meeting was held, and the room was packed with curious homeowners. Evelyn stood at the head of the long table, trying to maintain her composure, while Stephen hovered uncertainly beside her. As Darius walked in, he could feel the tension thickening. Before Evelyn could start, Darius raised his hand, holding a neatly organized folder. I'd like to speak first, he declared. Evelyn hesitated, clearly annoyed, but nodded reluctantly. Darius approached the center of the room, unfolding the first document. This, he began, holding up the title deed, is the legal proof of ownership of my property, duly recorded and verified. A few whispers rustled through the room as he continued. Furthermore, Darius added, unfolding another paper, this is the purchase agreement for 216 Maplewood Drive, Evelyn's house. I legally acquired it through auction when she defaulted on HOA dues. Evelyn's face went pale, her mouth opening in shock. Stephen's eyes widened, glancing nervously at her. The room fell deathly silent. And this, Darius finished, holding up one last document, is the official complaint I filed against Evelyn Monroe for harassment and misuse of HOA authority. I'm asking the board to vote on her immediate removal as president. The homeowners exchanged stunned glances, clearly taken aback by the revelation. Evelyn tried to interject, but her words came out choked and scattered. One of the board members, visibly shaken, nodded solemnly. We will take this matter seriously, he admitted. Darius locked eyes with Evelyn, unflinching. You tried to force me out of my own home, he said, his voice unwavering. But now it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions. The board members murmured among themselves, and within minutes, Stephen announced that a vote would be conducted. As hands went up one by one to remove Evelyn from her position, the reality finally struck her. She had lost. Evelyn's once commanding presence faded into a mere shadow of itself as she turned and walked out, defeated and humiliated. Darius watched her leave, his heart steady, knowing that justice had finally been served. After the tense meeting, Darius walked out of the HOA boardroom feeling a wave of relief wash over him. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the neatly manicured lawns of Maplewood Hills, and small groups of neighbors stood in clusters, whispering about what had just unfolded. He could hear bits and pieces of their conversations, some shocked, some amused, and many clearly relieved that Evelyn's reign of terror was over. Evelyn had lost everything: her position as HOA president, her house, and most importantly, her reputation. No longer the authoritative figure who controlled the neighborhood with an iron fist, she had been exposed for what she truly was: a bully hiding behind rules. Darius watched as Evelyn hurried away from the meeting, her face pale and her posture defeated. Stephen, the HOA vice president, followed a few steps behind, looking equally unsettled. Darius knew it wasn't just about bringing Evelyn down. It was about standing up against injustice and proving that he belonged in this community just as much as anyone else. He wasn't the one who needed to change. The neighborhood did. As he walked back to his house, a few neighbors cautiously approached him. One of them was Lisa, a middle-aged woman who lived a few houses down. She offered a tentative smile. "Hey, Darius," she began, her voice tinged with guilt. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. I didn't know how bad things had gotten. Evelyn, she just always made it seem like she was right about everything." Darius nodded, his expression softening. "It's all right. I get it. Sometimes it's easier to go along with things than to challenge them. But I appreciate you saying something now." Lisa hesitated for a moment, then nodded with a sense of relief. "Thanks for standing up to her. It took a lot of courage." She gave him a small wave before walking away, clearly still processing the events of the day. That night, Darius sat on his porch, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The phone buzzed on the table next to him. It was a message from Joe, his attorney. "Victory. HOA board just sent a formal apology letter. Evelyn's officially removed from her position, and they're revising their complaint process to prevent abuse of power. Nicely done." Darius couldn't help but smile. The sense of justice finally being served filled his chest with a quiet pride. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the peaceful silence that now seemed to blanket the neighborhood. A month later, a for sale sign appeared in front of Evelyn's former house. She had been forced to move out after defaulting on her HOA dues, and no one in the neighborhood seemed particularly sad to see her go. Rumor had it she was staying with her sister on the other side of town, trying to scrape together enough to start over. As Maplewood Hills adjusted to life without Evelyn's oppressive presence, the atmosphere grew lighter. Neighbors who once avoided Darius now greeted him with nods and polite smiles. One evening, as he watered his front lawn, Lisa approached again, this time holding a plate of cookies. "I know it's a bit late," she said sheepishly, "but welcome to the neighborhood. I should have done this sooner." Darius chuckled, taking the plate. "Better late than never," he replied, popping a cookie into his mouth. It was a little stale, but the gesture was sincere, and he appreciated it. Some of the other neighbors passed by, offering hesitant but friendly waves. The walls of tension and prejudice that had once surrounded him were finally beginning to crumble. It wasn't just the end of Evelyn's toxic influence. It was a new beginning for the entire community. Darius looked out over his yard, the sunset painting the sky in warm hues of gold and pink. He knew that changing the mindset of an entire community wouldn't happen overnight, but he had taken the first step. The lesson was clear. Real power doesn't come from controlling others or enforcing rules for the sake of dominance. It comes from standing firm in the truth, defending what's right, and refusing to be intimidated by prejudice. Darius took a deep breath and leaned back in his porch chair, finally feeling at peace. The neighborhood that had once seemed hostile was slowly becoming home, and he knew without a doubt that he had earned his place there, fair and square. In modern life, we often encounter injustice, prejudice, or discrimination simply because of differences in background, race, or social status. The story of Darius is not just about fighting for personal rights, but also a reminder of the power of patience, confidence, and courage. Sometimes it's easy to succumb to pressure from the community or the abuse of power by those in authority. But instead of backing down, we must remain calm, stand up, and use our intellect and reason to protect ourselves. True power doesn't lie in a title or position, but in the confidence to face injustice with determination and integrity. There are those who try to control others by creating unreasonable rules or imposing personal standards. But as Darius proved, integrity and fairness will always prevail. The key is to never let anyone take away your value or allow prejudice to make you doubt your worth. Remember that the greatest strength comes from believing in yourself and bravely confronting adversity. Standing up for what is right not only protects your own dignity, but also inspires change in the community around you.